tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa namo arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so today we start the fall semester. Okay, and today we'll be taking it's called the Culasaccaka Sutta, the shorter discourse to Saccaka. You don't know? Nina, you could sit here, and then you could share your book with this woman here.
I just don't like Francis, but that's okay.
You don't like what? Doesn't like?
Good practice. Francis.
Oh.
I kind of like to hide in the corner, you know? Oops.
Okay, so this sutta, it's a little bit combination, I would call it a little bit like a combination of a situation comedy, but with some serious teachings inside. So has a little bit of a humorous framework. So it begins when there is a certain debater. His name is Saccaka. The word Saccaka actually means one who speaks the truth. And he is said to be a son of the Nikantas. The Nikantas were the Jains. So it seems he came from a Jain family. But it's not at all obvious that he is a follower of the Jain teaching. But rather he seems to be something like in Greek philosophy they call them the sophists. They're people who are skilled in the arts of debate. And so they travel around the country finding famous teachers, philosophers, and then they just try to debate with them in order to use logic and reasoning to disprove the position of the other person. Okay, so apparently when this sutta opens, Saccaka has been visiting the large city of Vaisali. It was one of the major cities in India during the time of the Buddha. And so he's described as a debater and a clever speaker, regarded by many as a saint. It seems like being a clever speaker is hardly a reason for being regarded by many as a saint. But anyway, he was making a very unsaintly statement in front of the assembly of Vaisali. This would probably be a place where people gather, because Vaisali was like a self-governing aristocratic republic rather than a kingdom, a monarchy. And so I would believe that the people would gather in an assembly hall and they would conduct the affairs of the city from that assembly hall. Just like small towns here have a town hall where people meet to conduct the affairs of the town. So he comes before this assembly and then he starts speaking rather boastfully, saying that he sees no other ascetic or Brahmin, even one who's the head of an order, the head of a group, the teacher of a group, even one who claims to be fully enlightened, who would not shake, shiver, and tremble, and sweat under the armpits if he were to engage in debate with me, then to make his point even more strongly, he says, if I were to engage in debate with a senseless post of wood, even that post of wood would shake, shiver, and tremble, not to speak about human beings. Okay, so at this time, the Buddha has been living in just outside the city of Vesali in a place called the Great Woods. And so one of the disciples of the Buddha, this is the monk named Assaji. He was one of the first 5 disciples of the Buddha, and the one responsible for converting Sariputta and bringing Sariputta to the Dharma. So the Venerable Assaji, one day, he took his alms bowl and he went into Vesali on his alms round. So then Saccaka sees Assaji walking on alms round, and he comes up to him, greets him, and then he must know that Assaji is a disciple of the Buddha, the one that they call the ascetic Gautama. And so he asked Assaji, how does the ascetic Gautama discipline or train his disciples? What is the kind of instruction that he usually gives to his disciples? Okay, then Assaji gives a rather very brief statement in order to show what he considers the essence of the Buddha's teaching. So apparently this monk Assaji was not one who liked many words, but even when Sariputta approached him for a teaching, Assaji just spoke one 4-line stanza, but that was enough to bring Sariputta to the first stage of enlightenment. Okay, so in this case also, Assaji speaks very concisely, and he says, material form is impermanent, feeling is impermanent, perception is impermanent, the mental formations are impermanent, consciousness is impermanent. So in other words, he's saying that the 5 aggregates are impermanent, then material form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, mental formations are not self, consciousness is not self. Thus, all formations or all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, and all things, all phenomena, are not self. So that is the way the Buddha trains his disciples, and that is the way he presents his teaching to his disciples. Anything missing here? Yeah, the characteristic of dukkha is missing. Usually we have 3 characteristics: anicca, dukkha, anatta, right? Impermanent, suffering or unsatisfactory, and non-self. So why is suffering missing?
Because they're free of it?
What?
Because the monks perhaps are free of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But Assaji is asking, how does the Buddha usually teach his disciples?
Oh, okay.
Sometimes I think it's because suffering is inherent in these 2, impermanence and non-self.
Yeah, but usually the Buddha speaks about suffering, even though it's inherent.
You wrote it in the back.
It's,
Excuse me?
it's in the footnote.
In the footnote.
Yeah, I know. But that's what the commentary says.
Oh.
Yes?
I'm going to give it out of the book, so I'm going to cheat a little. I think the answer is he omits the second of the 3 characteristics, dukkha or suffering, he explains that Ajaja omitted this,
Asaji,
Asajiya omitted this in order to avoid giving Saccaka the opportunity to attempt a
refutation, yeah.
Thank you, of the Buddha's doctrine.
Okay. Yeah, that is basically what that's what the commentary says. You have
I
something?
have another thought, because this particular individual was so, it is the boaster we are speaking of, he was so caught up in self
Yeah.
and his powers that maybe this is how he felt he could reach him the best.
Maybe so, yeah. I don't have a definite answer in mind, I just wanted to know.
You do this a lot. But it feels like this guy was so caught up in himself
Yeah,
that the only valuable teaching, the only door open was to directly hit him right on his.
to go very directly for the
Yeah.
non-self. Maybe so, yeah. Yeah, I don't know any other explanation apart from what the commentary says, so all we can do is sort of speculate. The sutta itself doesn't give an explicit answer. Okay. So anyway, usually we have 3 characteristics, but for some reason, the characteristic of suffering, it's omitted here. Okay, so now after Asaji replies in this way, Saccaka is being a little bit, he's trying to be provocative. So, he's trying to put Asaji's teacher down in his presence. So he says, if we have heard what the recluse Gautama asserts, we have indeed heard what is disagreeable. Then he says, perhaps sometime or other we might meet this Master Gautama and have some conversation with him. Perhaps we, really means I, might detach him from that evil view. So he's going to argue with the Buddha and try to convince the Buddha to give up this view of impermanence and non-self, so that the Buddha will say, yes, some things are permanent, some things are self. Okay, so one time, maybe a little bit later, the Lichavis were meeting in their assembly hall, and then Saccaka came to them and said, I'm going out to debate with the ascetic Gautama. Why don't you guys come along and follow me, and you'll see something that's going to blow your mind. You're going to see me. Then he says, if this recluse Gautama maintains before me what was said by his famous disciple, the Bhikkhu Asaji, then just as a strong man might grab a long-haired ram by the hair and drag him this way, drag him that way, drag him around, so in debate I'm going to drag the recluse Gautama, drag him this way, drag him that way, drag him around. And another simile about a brewer's workman, I don't know what that's like. I don't have any experience brewing liquor. And finally, actually these are very vivid similes. Just as a strong brewer's mixer might take a strainer by the corners and shake it down, shake it up, and thump it about, so in debate I'm going to shake this Gautama down, shake him up, and thump him about. And just as a 60-year-old elephant might plunge into a deep pond and enjoy playing the game of hemp washing. I think what this actually means is that the people who are in charge of the elephant throw it a pile of hemp, and the elephant takes the hemp and with the trunk and hits one part of the body, hits the other part, hits the head in order to wash itself. So I'm going to enjoy playing the game of hemp washing with the recluse Gautama. Come, O Lichavis, come today, that he puts this mildly, there will be some conversation between myself and the recluse Gautama. Whatever gave you the impression that he was very full of himself? He's just going to have a little conversation. Okay, now the Lichavis, probably they were divided in their degree of faith in the Buddha. Some of them were followers of the Buddha, some of them weren't. And so those who were followers of the Buddha, let's say those who are not the followers of the Buddha, maybe those who were very highly impressed with Saccaka, thought to themselves or said, who is this recluse Gautama that he could refute Saccaka in debate? On the contrary, Saccaka is going to defeat and refute the recluse Gautama. But some of the others who must have been impressed by the Buddha said, who is this Saccaka? He won't be able to beat the Buddha, but it's rather the Buddha who's going to refute the Saccaka, the Niganta's son, in debate. Okay, so all of them set out from Vesali, and they go to this hall with the peaked roof where the Buddha is living. Okay, when they arrive, they're directed to a little patch of woods where the Buddha is sitting under a tree for meditation. And then this group comes up to the Buddha, they exchange greetings with him. And then, now I'm in paragraph 9, Saccaka, after sitting down, he says to the Buddha, he says, I would like to, he puts this very mildly, he doesn't want to come on too aggressively, so he speaks very politely. I would like to question Master Gautama about a certain point. If Master Gautama would kindly grant me the favor of answering my question. Okay, so Saccaka asked the same question. How do you instruct your disciples? How do you discipline your disciples? And then the Buddha, he must have known the way Assaji had replied. So the Buddha replies in exactly the same way. He says, material form and so on is impermanent, and material form and so on is not self. Thus all formations are impermanent, all dharmas, all phenomena are not self. That is the way I discipline my disciples, and that is how I usually present instruction to my disciples. Okay, now Saccaka, rather than directly attacking the Buddha's position, is going to approach it somewhat indirectly by using a simile, because I guess this is supposed to be part of his skill as a debater, is to be able to pick up similes which he thinks accurately represent the position of his opponent. And then he'll use the simile as a way of undermining the position of his opponent. And so he says, just as when seeds and plants, whatever their kind, grow, increase, and mature, all do so in dependence upon the earth, based upon the earth. And just as whatever strenuous works are done, all are done in dependence upon the earth, based upon the earth, so too a person has material form as self, and based on material form, he produces merit or demerit. A person has feeling as self, he has perception as self, he has the mental formations as self. a person has consciousness as self, and based upon consciousness, he produces merit or demerit. So let's maybe try to see the simile or depict it visually. Okay, does this seem like an accurate representation of simile and what it represents? It's interesting, maybe a little puzzling, that Saccaka seems to be making a distinction between the self, which consists of the five aggregates, and the person who produces merit or demerit. So the person has or possesses the self, and then the self consists in feeling, perception, the self consists in form, feeling, perception, and so on. But there seems almost to be like a dualistic distinction between the person and the self. It seems to me a little bit strange. What one would say is that if the person has, well, let us say, a form, feeling, perception, and so on of the self, then one would say that the self does merit or demerit. But then what is the self? But form, feeling, perception, and so on.
Yeah, but if you have a wrong view, that's one of the ways you can have wrong view that the Buddha goes into sometimes. He thinks he is form, or he thinks he is form possessing form.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, let us see how this continues. Okay, so the Buddha now is going to sort of sound him out, to sort of get him to first to reconfirm his view. So he says, the Buddha asks him, are you asserting thus, material form is myself, feeling is myself, perception is myself, the mental formations are myself, consciousness is myself? Okay, then Saccaka admits this. Form, feeling, perception, and so on, that is myself. Saccaka says, material form, feeling, and so on, this is my, up to consciousness, that is myself, that's what I say. And then he points to the group of lychees and says, and so does this great multitude. You know, so it's sort of he's implying that if the great multitude believes something, that makes it true. Like if Glenn Beck or Rush Limbaugh were to stand up and they were to say, Obama is a Muslim, that's what I'm asserting, and so does this great multitude. Then they'll all say, yeah, he's a Muslim. So that doesn't make it true, the fact that one points to the multitude and they say, yes, yes. And so the Buddha says, what does this multitude really have to do with you? Please stick to your own position. Okay, so then Saccaka is sort of stripped of that support of the crowd behind him, and he has to admit, yes, that is my own position, form, feeling, perception, so on, that is myself. Okay, now the Buddha, again, instead of attacking Saccaka's position directly, is going to use a different simile in order to undermine Saccaka's position. So he asks Saccaka a question, and he's referring to him by the name Agivesana. That's probably his family name. Saccaka was probably his personal name. Okay, so he says, then I will ask you a question, Agivesana. Answer it as you choose. Now what do you think? Suppose a powerful king, like King Pasenadi of Kosala, or King Ajatasattu of Magadha, can such a king exercise power in his own realm such that he can execute those who should be executed, fine those who should be fined, and banish those who should be banished? So in India, in the Buddha's time, in northern India, there were two very powerful monarchies. In the far north, there was Kosala, that was ruled by King Pasenadi, and in the center east, there was Magadha, the kingdom of Magadha, which was ruled by King Ajatasattu. And both of them were probably autocratic tyrants who could rule according to their own will. Pasenadi was a follower of the Buddha, so his reign would have been milder. And King Ajatasattu actually came to power by killing his own father to get the throne, without having to wait until his father grew old. So he was more tyrannical, I think. But both of them were absolute monarchs who could do whatever they wanted in their own realm. Okay, so then Saccaka replies that this is the case, that these two powerful kings exercise that power in their kingdom so they could execute anybody they want, banish anybody that they wanted, find anybody that they wanted. And then he says, even in these communities, these republics, like the Vajjian Republic, or the Malan Republic, the people exercise that kind of power collectively in their realms. So certainly these kings could exercise such power. Okay, then the Buddha asks him, when you say material form is myself, do you exercise any such power over material form so that you could say, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus? In other words, do you have such absolute power, absolute control over form, that you can, the bodily form, that you can control it in any way according to your will? So whatever you want it to be, it will automatically and instantaneously conform to one's will. It will follow your wishes, your intentions. So, if I had that control over this body, then I wouldn't have to buy razors, to shave. I could just say when the whiskers start to get a little long, let the whiskers disappear, and they would disappear. And if I ever feel like a cold coming on, I don't have to gargle with salt water, take cold medicine, or take any other kind of treatment, but just have to make the will. Let that cold go away, and it will go away. And, I'm getting old, wrinkles start coming, hair turning gray. I don't have to use hair dye to make my hair remain brown, but I just make the will, let my hair always remain brown, the head never get bald. May I not grow old, fall sick, and of course, may I not die, and I won't die. Okay, so the Buddha asks whether you have that kind of power over the body, over material form. And when he asked that question, Saccaka was a bright guy, he was intelligent, so he saw the point that the Buddha was getting at. And so he wasn't going to fall into the Buddha's trap, and so he remained silent. Okay. Okay, then the second time the Buddha asked him that question, and the second time Saccaka remained silent. Okay, then the Buddha says to him, Abhivesana, answer now. Now is not the time to be silent. If anyone is asked a reasonable question up to the third time by the Tathagata, and he still does not answer, his head will split into 7 pieces there and then. Okay, we think, wow, the Buddha is really cruel and brutal, right? Always they say, you see, at least some the Buddhists, they compare Buddhism to Christianity. They say, you see, Jesus says the evildoer will go to hell, but Buddha is always very kind and compassionate to everybody. So why? Here he's saying that your head is going to split into 7 pieces. But actually the Buddha, that's not his own will. He doesn't want Saccaka's head to split. But this is supposed to be like a fixed principle, that the Buddha is being perfectly reasonable, and he's asking the person the question up to 3 times. And it was Saccaka who engaged the Buddha in debate. The Buddha didn't come up to start arguing with Saccaka. And so if Saccaka keeps silent, he's going back on his original intention of debating with the Buddha. And the Buddha is giving him this warning in advance to protect him from having to undergo this fate. And now, this is to make things very dramatic. I can imagine that, you see, these suttas were passed down orally for hundreds of years. And so those who are teaching the suttas, maybe they would consider it a little bit boring if you're just giving a blow-by-blow description of a debate. So they want to make the sutta a little bit colorful, like we're watching it on TV, or Steven Spielberg, is that his name? Movie? Like Jurassic Park, or what's one of these others? The Andromeda Factor, is that it? Okay, so then suddenly this thunderbolt-wielding spirit holding an iron thunderbolt appears. The thunderbolt that's burning, blazing, and glowing. And he appears in the air just above Saccaka, holding the thunderbolt, thinking, if Saccaka is asked that question up to 3 times by the Buddha and he doesn't answer, I'm going to split his head into 7 pieces. Okay, so the Buddha looks over across at Saccaka and sees the spirit holding the thunderbolt. And then Saccaka looks over, he must get a sense of some flaming presence behind his shoulder. So he turns over to look. And he sees that probably a fierce-looking spirit there holding the thunderbolt right above his head. And so then he gets terrified, frightened, alarmed, and he sort of says to the Buddha, please call him off, I'll answer you. Okay, so now the Buddha asks the question the 3rd time. You know, after this, we could see the teacher is explaining the discourse, and people in India, the Buddha's time, they'll believe in these spirits. And so they'll all be holding their heads and going, please answer, Saccaka, please, please, don't remain silent. Okay, so now the Buddha asks the question the 3rd time, and now Saccaka says, he asks, do you have such power or control over material form so that you can say, let my form be thus, let it become what I want it to be, let my form not be thus, not be the way I don't want it to be. Okay, then Saccaka has to admit, no, Master Gautama. Then the Buddha says, pay attention, Saccaka. Pay attention to what you've replied. What you said afterwards does not agree with what you said before, and what you said before doesn't agree with what you said afterwards. Now the Buddha is just going to frame the questions around the other aggregates. Do you have such power over feeling that you can control it in any way you want? Saccaka says no. Then, do you have such power over perception? No. Do you have such power over the mental formations, the sankharas, so that you can control them in any way that you want? Saccaka says no. Then the 5th aggregate, do you have such power, such control over consciousness, so that you can say, let my consciousness be thus, let my consciousness not be thus? And Saccaka says, no. Okay, so now the Buddha, again, he says, pay attention, Agivesana, pay attention how you reply. What you said afterwards does not agree with what you said before, nor does what you said before agree with what you said afterwards. Okay, why is there some contradiction between what Saccaka said earlier and what he said afterwards? What is the contradiction?
He just said that his self is all those things.
Yeah.
And now he's saying his self is not, or he does not have power over the things that he said was self.
Okay, earlier he just said the person has material form as self, feeling as self, and so on. Then based on material form, he produces merit or demerit. So the person can still do merit or demerit. So where is the contradiction? There's something implicit here which is not stated explicitly. What is that? What is implicit? Person?
Well, he's saying that for the self to be identical, for the self to actually possess the five aggregates, it must have control over them.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is the idea of possession equals control.
Okay, that's a good point. But just repeat it with the microphone.
The assumption is that identity or possession equals control.
Yeah, that is exactly the point. So the idea that's sort of implicit here, and this has to do maybe with the way the concept of self is construed in Indian thought at the time of the Buddha, that for something to be self, it must be sort of, you could say, self-controlling. It must be autonomous. It must have mastery over itself. Must have control over itself.
It's like the statement that possession is 9/10 of the law.
And so if there's something that one identifies as being I, mine, or myself, but one doesn't have complete control over it, then from this point of view, based on that assumption of Indian thought, what one is taking to be self isn't really self. So if I say, I am the body is myself, but I don't have this control over the body, then it means the body is not myself and the body is not mine. If I say feeling is myself, then I have to be able, that means that I have such control over feeling that if I want to feel happy and joyful, I just have to think, let me be joyful, and I'll be joyful. And if I'm feeling sad, upset, I just have to think, let me not be sad, and I won't be sad. Again, perceptions. If I'm seeing the same dreary sight every day, maybe I'm living on the street with overfull garbage cans, with the garbage falling onto the ground because the garbage collectors are on strike, and cars are always honking their horns. You know, where I grew up, about 2 blocks away from the subway train, what they call it, the elevated subway train, the L. And I would see that there were people who were living, you know, there were apartments that go right alongside the subway train. In fact, I think I had a friend who lived in an apartment right alongside that subway train when I was in elementary school, and I would visit him. And always you hear the trains going by. I would wonder, how do people live? How can they fall asleep in the apartments with the trains going by all the time? But they get used to it. But if one were living there, one would be thinking, let there be no perception of the sound of trains, but the trains go by, one has to keep it up. And similarly with the will, I would be able to will whatever I want. I wouldn't be involved with any kind of conflict of motives. And I'd be able to be conscious of everything that I wanted, whatever I want. Okay, so the idea of self implies this mastery, autonomy, control over what is taken to be self. Just as in the state of Kosala, the state of Magadha, King Pasenadi or King Ajatasattu, they are the rulers of those states. And so those states are truly theirs. They are like the self in those states. And so they can control them, they can do anything they want in those states. So the self would have to have that kind of control over, or the person would have to have that kind of control over body, feeling, perception, if they were self. But because we don't have that control, as Saccaka admits, therefore, he sees the point already that these things are really unsatisfactory. They're really dukkha because we can't control them. We can't get rid of the suffering inherent in them just through our will. And so he's starting to see the point of the Buddha's argument. Let me put this one diagrammatically. Okay, so we might say that the king is the king precisely because he has this complete control in his realm. Actually, probably in reality, the king doesn't have such control. You know, there are groups of rebels that might be plotting a rebellion in some secret corner of, even of the capital, and maybe the king's concubines in the harem are secretly having affairs with secret visitors to the harem, and the king's son might be a troublesome little brat who's planning to overthrow his father. So then there can be robbers, robbers who are conducting raids on the houses in the kingdom. So there can be many problems in the state. But just sort of the common belief is that the king is the sovereign of the land, so in principle he has complete control, even if he doesn't in reality. Okay, so just as the king has complete control over the state, so if the five aggregates are the self, then the person should have that complete control over the five aggregates. But I put a cross there, an X, to show that the person doesn't have that control. And so then the conclusion follows that the five aggregates are not the self. What happened to the one which was using? I just had it in my head. Okay.
Lack of total control.
What is that?
You don't have total control over the camera.
Yeah, it disappeared.
It's the space aliens.
It's not self.
Okay, we'll have to do this one. Therefore. It's this one actually. I think this was just at the end. I see, this is like an eraser, that's why you put it on the bottom. Yeah. See, I do have total control over it. Okay, so this is the point of the Buddha's argument, even though it's not really made very explicit. Okay, but now the Buddha... Did somebody want to say something about the argument? Any questions or...
The whole thing hinges on if you accept that self means you have control. That whole argument hinges just on that point. And I spoke to you about that yesterday. Who says? That's all.
Yeah, this is the way... Let us say, this is the way the concept of self would have been understood in India at that time. But also, maybe this is an implicit, it struck me after we had that conversation. Maybe this is not something just peculiar to the Indian cultural view of that period, or philosophical view of that period. But maybe this is a kind of underlying, deep, underlying, maybe subconscious presupposition that people take, even though they might not think explicitly in terms of